On a bitter winter afternoon, 155 people boarded a plane in New York, completely unaware that minutes after takeoff, something would happen that aviation itself had barely considered possible. Most of us think we know this story. Tom Hanks made sure of that. But cinema polishes truth into something simpler than reality, and the reality is far more remarkable than any film. So let's go back, minute by minute, decision by decision. I'll show you what actually happened, what the movie got right, what it quietly invented, and why that gray stretch of river running through the heart of New York earned its name forever, the Miracle on the Hudson. January 15th, 2009, New York City, 3 p.m., -5 degrees Celsius, and a sky buried under winter clouds, the kind of cold that would prove decisive for everything that followed. 8 years earlier, this city had watched its skyline burn. Today, it was about to make headlines again, but this time, for something different. At LaGuardia Airport, just 5 kilometers from the towers of Manhattan, a U.S. Airways Airbus A320 was preparing for departure. The aircraft had 10 years of service behind it. On board, 150 passengers, 3 cabin crew, 2 pilots, 155 lives in total. In the left seat sat Captain Chesley Burnett Sullenberger, Sully, 57 years old, 19,663 flight hours. Before the airlines, he had flown F-4 Phantoms for the United States Air Force, commanded military exercises, led missions. Today, as always, the aircraft was his responsibility. His word was final. In the right seat, First Officer Jeffrey Bruce Skiles, 49 years old, 15,643 flight hours, but only 37 on the A320. He had just been certified on this aircraft. On this flight, Skiles was the pilot flying. Sully was pilot monitoring, managing communications, running checklists, watching. The destination was Charlotte, with a connection onto Seattle. The aircraft was heavy, legal, but close to its limit. At 3:25 p.m., the tower cleared them for runway 4. 10 seconds later, full thrust. The engines roared, the brakes released, and 155 lives began accelerating down the tarmac. The nose lifted. New York fell away beneath them. They banked left, climbing steadily through 2,300 feet. Flaps retracted. Everything normal. At 3:27:07, Sully completed the after-takeoff checklist and confirmed. All in order. 3 seconds later, the worst happened. From this moment on, I want to put you inside that cockpit, not as an observer, as Sully himself, because only from that seat can you truly understand why this story deserves its name. What follows is a reconstruction built from the raw data of the black boxes. Every second is real. The checklist is complete. For a fraction of a second, everything is normal. Then you see them, a flock of birds, and before the warning even leaves your mouth, they hit. The impacts are violent, almost explosive, a sound you have never heard in tens of thousands of hours of flight. Then comes something worse, silence. The engines begin to wind down. You scan the instruments, one engine failing. You call it out. Then your eyes jump to the second gauge and your stomach drops. Both engines gone. You correct yourself immediately. Both engines out. Your hand hits the restart switch. You start the APU. You look out the window and see nothing but buildings in every direction. The aircraft is no longer climbing. It is falling. You make the only decision that matters. My aircraft. Control transfers to your hands. You tell Skiles to open the emergency manual. Dual engine failure. A procedure that almost no pilot has ever had to use for real. You key the radio. Mayday, mayday. Loss of thrust in both engines due to bird strike. You ask to return to LaGuardia. The controller gives you heading 220. You bank left, already calculating, already doubting. Skiles is running the checklist. Maintain 300 knots, he says. You're at 210. 300 is a fantasy. They offer you runway 13. You look toward it. You already know. Not viable. Then you look ahead and see it, the Hudson River, gray and wide, cutting through the city. You report it over the radio, almost casually. You might end up there. Skiles dials 7700 into the transponder, the emergency code. The controller offers runway 31. Impossible. The altitude is bleeding away, and the only thing keeping you alive is airspeed. The moment you lose speed, you lose everything. Skiles suggests the controller may have meant runway 13. You scan every direction. To the left, already ruled out. Straight ahead, Manhattan, steel and glass, and 10 million people. But to the right, Teterboro Airport, just across the river in New Jersey. You ask, they clear you for it. You say yes, then silence. A few seconds while the controller sets it up, the alarms screaming in the background, the ECAM blazing red with failures. You use those seconds to reach for the PA system. Brace for impact. 150 passengers hear those 3 words and understand that this is not a drill. The restart attempts continue. Nothing. The engines are dead, and they are staying dead. Teterboro comes back on the radio. Runway 1 is yours. You already know what your answer is. We're going to the Hudson. The controller asks you to repeat. You don't answer. There is nothing left to say to him. Every remaining fraction of your attention belongs to the aircraft, to the speed, to the river rising beneath you. You are 57 years old. You have 19,663 hours in the air. Every single one of them has led to this moment. You ask Skiles to deploy the flaps. The controller is still offering runways. You've stopped listening. The ground proximity alarms begin firing, warning you to climb, to climb, to climb. You cannot climb. The flaps finish deploying, and Skiles asks if you want more. No. Flaps 2. Keep them there. You ask him if he has any ideas. He has none. The river is right beneath you now. The speed is dangerously low. You tell Skiles to prepare for impact. 5 seconds later, the aircraft hits the water. From takeoff to impact, 208 seconds, less than 3.5 minutes. So why do we call it a miracle? Because within those 208 seconds, 4 decisions separated a disaster from a legend. The first, Sully identified the double engine failure in 4 seconds. 4. While flying over one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, both pilots already knew the full extent of what they were facing before most people would have even registered that something was wrong. The second, and arguably the most important. 10 seconds after the bird strike, Sully started the APU. The APU is a small generator housed in the tail of the aircraft. Under normal conditions, it's a backup. In this moment, it was everything. Without it, the A320 would have fallen back on the Rat, a small emergency propeller that spins in the airflow and powers only the most basic systems. The computer protections that normally prevent a pilot from pushing the aircraft beyond its safe limits would have disappeared entirely. The aircraft would have become brutally difficult to fly. By starting the APU, Sully kept those protections alive. Instead of fighting the airplane, he could think. Instead of surviving, he could plan. The third, he immediately accepted that LaGuardia was gone. He didn't chase it. He didn't gamble. He knew that a failed attempt to reach the airport meant crashing into buildings, and he refused to let that happen. He stayed over the river and methodically eliminated every other option. The investigation that followed would run simulator tests replicating the exact conditions of that day. The results were striking. If pilots turned back immediately after the strike, they could reach LaGuardia. But add a realistic 35-second delay, the time any real crew would need to assess what just happened. And no one made it. Not once. Aviation doesn't work like the movies. You don't spin the aircraft around the moment something fails. You understand the problem first, which means Sully's decision wasn't a failure of nerve, it was the correct call. The fourth, he kept the flaps at position 2, not maximum, overriding the checklist. Maximum flaps would have slowed the aircraft further. That sounds logical, but Sully understood that the real danger wasn't forward speed, it was the vertical descent rate. Hit water descending too steeply, and the fuselage doesn't skip, it shatters. He needed to flare at the last second, lift the nose, bleed off the sink rate, cushion the impact, and to flare, he needed airspeed. Flaps 2 gave him that margin. 4 decisions, each one made in seconds, each one correct. There was one more detail, smaller, but worth knowing. When Sully asked Skiles if he had any ideas, it wasn't desperation, it was discipline. It was a captain giving his first officer explicit permission to speak, to challenge, to catch anything that might have been missed. Skiles had nothing to add, but the question itself mattered. After the accident, investigators studied every second of that flight with the same resources they would have applied had all 155 people died. That is how aviation works. And that is why aviation is the safest form of travel in human history. And then there is this. During the climb, before the birds, before everything, at around 2,000 feet, Sully glanced left, looked out at the gray winter sky, and saw the Hudson River stretching below him. He smiled and said, "Wow, we've got quite a view of the Hudson today." 30 seconds after saying it, he landed on it. How do birds bring down a 70-ton aircraft? The answer is bad luck, compounded. Aircraft are tested against bird strikes. For the A320, the tests used birds weighing around 1 kilogram. The Canada geese that hit Flight 1549 weighed up to 4. Feather analysis confirmed it. And instead of striking the fan blades, where most birds stop, they were pulled deep into the compressor core. Both engines, at least 2 birds each. One engine lost, a serious incident. A footnote in an aviation report. Both engines lost at low altitude over Manhattan, something that had almost never been considered. The checklists Sully was supposed to follow were not built for this. The dual engine failure checklist called for 300 knots to attempt a restart. They were flying at 210, barely above the city, with nowhere to dive. The checklist was written for high altitude, where speed can be traded for time. That option didn't exist here. The ditching checklist called for maximum flaps, but Airbus wrote that procedure assuming at least one engine would still be running, enough thrust to maintain a gentle 1-degree glide and a descent rate of 200 feet per minute. At that rate, the aircraft survives water impact intact. Without any engine power, the aircraft couldn't hold 1 degree. To avoid stalling, the nose had to come down, steeper, faster. The actual descent rate was 10,000 feet per minute. In the final seconds, Sully hauled back on the controls and reduced it to 750, 3.5 times what Airbus had designed for. With maximum flaps, that flare would have been impossible. The aircraft would have been at too high an angle of attack. The stall protection system would have refused to let the nose rise further. The aircraft would have hit the water nose down. Flaps 2 gave him the margin. It saved everyone on board, and it wasn't in any checklist. The aircraft still broke apart at the rear section on impact. Water began flooding in during the evacuation, but the cabin crew responded with complete precision. Calm, fast, systematic. Within minutes, every passenger was out through the front and middle doors. The rear was blocked by the impact damage. Some stood on the wings in -6 degrees. Others clung to the inflatable slides, which crucially were designed to double as rafts. Those rafts are not mandatory on every A320. For that specific route, they weren't required. The aircraft had them anyway. Without them, people would have been in 5-degree water with nowhere to hold on. The first rescue boats arrived 2 minutes after impact. Within 20 minutes, all 155 people were accounted for, every single one alive. The film Sully gets the flight almost exactly right. The cockpit dialogue is reproduced nearly word for word, but it portrays the NTSB, the investigators, as adversaries, hunting for someone to blame. That is not what happened. The real hearing is on YouTube. Watch it. The tone is respectful, methodical, focused on learning. The investigation concluded quickly and clearly. Sully made the best possible decision. The checklists were revised. Engine certification standards were reviewed. The system learned. That is what aviation does. After the accident, investigators ran simulator tests with pilots who knew exactly what was coming. 0 delay, immediate reaction, and some still couldn't make it back to LaGuardia. Sully had no warning, no second chance, no pause button. He had 208 seconds, a dying aircraft, and 19,663 hours of experience. And in those 208 seconds, his hand did not tremble once. Most people will never know the full arc of Chesley Sullenberger's life in aviation, the decades of study, the military missions, the years of quietly reading accident reports, trying to understand what kills pilots so that he never would be one of them. They know 208 seconds. But here is the thing about those 208 seconds. They were not luck. They were not instinct. They were the inevitable result of everything that came before them. If Sully had followed the logic that looked correct on paper, New York might be remembering a different story today. Instead, he trusted something deeper than a checklist, and that is why we call it what we call it, the miracle on the Hudson.